The West has played a fundamental role in slowing the progression of Islamic reform, at least from the middle of the 20th century after the World War II up till the current time. This sounds like a counterintuitive thing to say if you observe the reality and if you listen to the Muslim leaders. The Muslim leaders have told us since time immemorial that the West, the Americans and the British, are in collusion to subvert Islam and possibly supplant it with Christianity. And we're told that among the strategies that the West seek to accomplish this would be through a sort of Islamic reform in order to legitimize un-Islamic and anti-Islamic practices among Muslims. And so, bearing this in mind, those of us in the Islamic reform sphere, those of us that really care about Islamic reform, have long theorized that it is the pushback against Western imperialism and consequently Islamic reform in the Muslim world that has given rise to a number of historical events that ultimately changed the course of Muslims in the 21st century towards a more militant or radical strain of Islam. One of these events would be the so-called Islamic Revolution of Iran that ended up ushering in the Shiite militant brand of Islam, personified by Ayatollah Khomeini, which ended up destroying and reversing much of the social progress Iran has made up till that point. You take in consideration the White Revolution, which gave women a lot of rights. And then another event, of course, would be the return to reign of the Saudi Wahhabists, the hardline Salafia or Salafists. And a lot of people do not know that in the 50s and 60s, Saudi Arabia was a relatively moderate Muslim country. You didn't have religious police harassing people on the streets to go for salat or to improve or to follow the dress codes. But by the 80s, when the Wahhabists had returned to power full force, they had not only enforced the headscarf upon women, they were contemplating enforcing the niqab as well. Now, to better understand the role the West has played in stifling Islamic reform, you must be able to visualize the impact an reform would have on the West economically and on a political scale. You have to visualize the economic and political impact an Islamic reform would have on the West. That's one thing. And you also have to be able to consider the two most essential elements as far as the Western powers are concerned, which is money and power, wealth and strength. That's what it all boils down to. Once you realize what is of utmost and ultimate importance or essence or value in the Western world, you'd be able to piece the puzzle together and the mask will slip off, everything will begin to make sense. Now, when I speak about the West, I'm not speaking about Westerners in general, because those typical random, common, everyday folks that live in Canada, live in the United States or in the United Kingdom, these people have no power on their own and they are just commoners. The West is defined and ruled by the oligarchs, the ultra capitalists, the upper class, and perhaps the upper middle class. These are the people that rule the West. They decide or influence the policy, and every decision, every direction the West is headed, they have the power or the capacity to modify and moderate it. These are the people who I define as the West in terms of in context of this video. Now I'm pointing out here that these people who define the West only value power and money. And this is very essential to understand because when you look at the Muslim world or you look at Muslims, for instance, they think that the West has this intention to crush Islam and perhaps replace it with Christianity, which is not true. The West has no interest in religion. The West dumped religion a very long time ago. Religion has no place in the West at this point in time. The West doesn't care about race or her own race or any other race of that matter. People speak about white supremacy all the time or white nationalism, but the West doesn't care about these things. These are views of fringe groups that have already been ostracized from the mainstream Western society. The West doesn't care about the nation state. The West is trying to abolish borders already. The West doesn't care about ethnicity, culture, and traditions. The West doesn't care about this. The West does not also care about the family units. So all these values that since time immemorial have been employed to keep communities in compact, the West has abolished these values and launched relentless attacks on them. So what the West treasure at this point in time, what really hold any significance for the West is power and money. And this is where I begin to elaborate on my initial thesis on this video on the West's contribution towards stifling the reform of Islam. So, here is a pop quiz. What would be the benefit of an Islamic reform to the West? What does the West stand to gain from an Islamic reform? A reform certainly won't address the Middle East problem. It would not diffuse the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It definitely would reduce the number of terror incidents in the Muslim world, but not so much in the West because those incidents are significantly rarer in the West than in the Muslim world. So the impact is not just going to be that marked. And so the only thing that I see as a potential benefit to the West would be an improvement of the Middle Eastern Muslims' image of the West. Perhaps Muslims in the Middle East would probably stop demonizing the West and blaming the West for all the problems that have afflicted them. But then again, you look at the West doesn't see this as a benefit. The West does not treasure or value an improvement of her image in the eyes of the Muslims in the Middle East, except for those Muslims migrants in the West whom the West are trying to recruit as a voter bloc. So look on the flip side, what does the West stand to lose from an Islamic reform? Well, an Islamic reform, provided it is liberal, it's rational, and progressive. I hate using that word progressive because thanks to the modern West, it has been corrupted into something else. But as long as the Islamic reform is rational, it's liberal, it's open-minded and not based upon blindly accepting any verse in the Quran or any tradition cited in the Hadith, then an Islamic reform could spell the beginning of an Islamic or Muslim renaissance. An Islamic reform would unburden Muslims from centuries of backward restrictive traditions that have held back scientific thought and innovations. Many people do not know this, but if you have studied Muslim sources, tafsir and hadith, you would understand why it was the Western world that gave us the industrial age and followed with the information age rather than the Muslim world. And here is an example, so that my listener will not just assume I'm making claims, that I'm saying making claims. Because there is this notion among Muslims that if we return back to Islam, when by Islam I mean the 7th century Islam, the Islam of Ibn Taymiyyah, the Islam of Ibn Hanbal, Imam Shafi, if we return back to the Islam of the Tabi'in, the Tabi'un and Tabi'in, that we'll be better off But if you look at Hadith books, for instance, if you look at Hadith books or Hadith teachings, Muslim traditions, Sunni Muslim traditions, there are teachings or there are hadiths that state specifically that a corpse should be buried immediately. Tampering with a dead body is discouraged. Once a human dies, the body should be buried immediately. And there have been specific reasons why this should be done according to Hadith books. But you look at it and you say, okay, well, our current knowledge of human biology, physiology, and anatomy, which enabled us to develop modern medicine, would not have been possible if we buried every corpse that we found. Because the cadaver has been a necessary and essential element in studying of the human body. And without cadaver, we would probably not have improved in medical science to the extent that we have in current times. Now, an Islamic reform would liberate Muslims to pursue independent thought and reason. And this could open the floodgates to scientific and technological development, just like the Protestant Renaissance did in the Christian world in the 16th century or thereabouts. And so, from this, a Muslim country could emerge in the possible future that could constitute a potential competitor with the West in the global scheme in terms of economics, medicine, military, politics, and all sorts of technological invention. And this is certainly not the West want. The West already have to deal with China as a competitor in a global scheme. The West does not want another competitor from the Muslim world. And because of this, an Islamic reform potentially would not be in the best interest of the Western world. And so what you have here is that the West want to remain the only player in the game. The West wants everyone else dependent upon them and inferior to them on science, on technology, on medicine, on economics and military. And the West recognized at some point in history, maybe along the 20th century, I don't know when, the West at a point in time was at war with what they thought was Islam. But now the West has recognized that Islam is the only barricade that is preventing a sort of renaissance from occurring in the Muslim world that would build Muslim countries into superpowers that could compete on the global scale against the West. And because of this, the West have no intention, at least at this point in time, to eradicate or destroy Muslims as Muslim leaders like Khomeini and all of the other Muslim leaders tell their citizens or the Muslims in the countries. And so when it comes to Islamic reform, look, the West has no interest and in fact is against Islamic reform because of what a reform in Islam could potentially bring about. They are in favor of things remaining in the status quo or Muslims going back to the 7th century as a lot of Islamists and the Muslim revivalist movements are seeking today. And so it all boils down to this: economics and politics, money and power, wealth and strength. The West may be glad it had undergone a religious reformation that is in part responsible to its ascent to superpower status today, but it doesn't want a similar process to occur in the Muslim world because of the apparent consequence and threat the outcome of such a reform would be on the hegemony of the West over the rest of the world.